Do we have Andy Clark with us today? Welcome. Could you go over the rules?
Give me 10 minutes.
Welcome, Mr. Clark. I am going to ask you to do a couple of things. I have not seen you in the audience, so I'm going to go over some of the basic parameters with you, if that's okay. First of all, I would welcome you and your family. I'm assuming I will ask that you will do an introduction for us for the record. The time frame that you have been allotted is 30 minutes. We like to engage a little bit and ask questions. I would recommend that you do leave some time for us to ask questions, but if you choose not to, then that is entirely up to you. I will warn you when we get to 10 minutes left, just to allow you the privilege of knowing how much time you have left, and we are trying to keep a tight schedule, and we don't like to go over the 30 minutes. So welcome, and again, please introduce yourself and the participants that you've brought with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all the members of the committee. I would appreciate a wave at 20 minutes if I'm still speaking at that point. And yes, good afternoon. Thanks for allowing me to present to you today. I'm here to share my perspective on why I believe Bill 39 is not in the best interests of New Brunswickers. My name is Andy Clark. I'm joined here by my wife, Shelley, and our 4 children. I shouldn't have to read notes when I'm introducing my family. My wife, Shelley, we have Alexandra, who is 13 years old. We have Gabriel, who is 12. We have Noah, who is 9. And we have Charlie, who is 6. And for those of you who are hungry and want to have a muffin, I apologize. My kids have eaten them all while we were waiting. So if you want to follow me over to Tim's after, I will supply the muffins. So just for context, Alex is going to be starting her first year at Leo Hayes next year, grade 9, a high schooler. So while I am emotional about the topic before us today, I'm also very emotional about that. I'm a parent of a high schooler all of a sudden. Gabriel is going to Nassau Middle, grade 7. Noah will be in grade 4 at Park Street School. And this year we'll be joined by Charlie, who is starting kindergarten, which is also making me very emotional. She was just born yesterday, I thought, and now she's going to school. So this is my family, and I thought it was important that they would be here today so they can support me in these remarks. Just a bit of context, I was born and raised here in Fredericton, graduated from FHS, went to Mount Allison University. I have a law degree from the University of British Columbia. I practiced law for several years. More recently, have been an entrepreneur and business executive here in Fredericton. My wife is originally from Newfoundland, has 7 years of post-secondary education. She's an entrepreneur and has been for 20 years. I say that because, you know, we're educated people, right? We like to use logic and analytical reasoning in the decisions that we make. And we love our children as much as any parents. And like all parents, the health and well-being of our children is the most important thing in the world to us. And so I say all this because over the last few months since all of this began, since Bill 39 was put forward and these amendments have sort of been in the public consciousness, I have been disheartened to read and to hear and to see in the media time and time and time and time again that all parents who have refused to vaccinate their kids, even though it may have been a well thought out and reasoned and logical thing to do, we're all anti-vaxxers and we're dangerously misinformed and we're conspiracy theorists. And so I'm here before you today to kind of get a sounding board to see if this is in fact the case. I don't think so, but then again, we all have blinders on, so it's good to have a forum that might be able to pass some judgment on that. I'd like to share with you today kind of the decision-making process that my wife and I have used in arriving at the conclusion that it's in the best interest of our family not to have our children vaccinated. And I invite you to think, is what I'm about to share with you foolish, as the Minister of Education has commented publicly about parents who have refused to vaccinate? Am I dangerously misinformed? Am I a conspiracy theorist? We're here today as parents. We are not associated with any group. We're not here representing anyone's interests, quite frankly, but those of our own family. And I think by extension, we're trying to stand up for the citizens of New Brunswick. And for the record, I do believe in gravity and I do believe in the moon landing. So why have we chosen not to vaccinate our 4 children? Well, as you know, the common refrain from proponents of mandatory vaccination is that vaccines are safe and effective, and that the benefits of vaccines outweigh the risks. So as conscientious parents who want to safeguard the health of our children prior to vaccinating, we wanted to investigate these claims a little further. And what we found out was that vaccines aren't always effective, meaning that for various reasons, they don't work for everyone who gets them. And we also learned that immunity from some vaccines wanes over time. And I haven't had the benefit of listening to all the presentations so far, but I've been in and out and tuning in, and I think that ground has been covered already, so I don't think that's that controversial that vaccines don't work for everybody. But that didn't concern us too much at the time, because we figured as long as vaccines were safe from serious side effects, then it would still make sense for our kids to get them. As long as vaccines were safe and mostly effective, that would be fine for us. But when we started to look into the safety of childhood vaccines, we found a lot of facts that contradicted that standard line that vaccines are safe. And the majority of this information wasn't sort of lurking deep in the dark web. It was right there in plain sight on government websites and publications. We learned that, and again, I don't have the benefit of everything you've heard here today, so I apologize if I'm repeating information you may have already heard, but I'm just kind of giving you what we found when we were making our decision-making process. And so there were a number of things that we found, and the first was that the Vaccine Corps of the United States has ordered the federal government in that country to pay out billions of dollars in compensation to families of children who have suffered serious injuries or deaths resulting from vaccines. And the information that's available on the government website that I have says since the program began up until, I'm not sure if it's today or last year or close to that, but there's 6,593 awards presented to families totaling $4.1 billion. And these are government statistics. So that's interesting. And of course, when we looked at this back before vaccinating, or before choosing whether or not to vaccinate our first child, the numbers were less than that. Of course, this is up to date until now. The second thing we found was that vaccine makers themselves pay nothing to these families. They are indemnified by the U.S. federal government since the enactment of the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Third thing we found was that the Supreme Court in the United States actually ruled that, or found that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And this is sort of the rationale to have the Vaccine Court in the United States, because we know that there are going to be injuries. The fourth thing we found was that thousands of adverse reactions are reported every year in the United States to the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS. And while these reports can come from a medical professional or a layperson, as I understand it, there's good evidence to show that only a fraction of adverse reactions are in fact reported. And there's a notable Harvard study commissioned by the CDC that estimates the number to be as low as 1%. The next thing we found was that similarly in Canada, thousands of adverse events following immunization are reported in Canada within the scope of the Canadian adverse events following immunization surveillance system, which is a mouthful, and I understand that that process is not quite as straightforward as it should be, and that if you ask a number of medical professionals, they may not in fact know what that is. And in Canada, my understanding also is that it's only medical professionals that may make a report under this system. The next thing we found, which is interesting, is that not everyone can be vaccinated, right? So there are immunocompromised, there are people by reason of age or medical or infirmity, they can't be vaccinated. We know this. And so when you start to think about that, well, why is that? Like, if vaccines are so safe, why can't everyone get them? And so we wondered, well, how can we know for sure that the same vaccine that another child can't get for medical reasons is safe for my child? We wondered if all children get like a full medical checkup prior to each of the 16 doses of vaccine that the routine immunization schedule calls for in a child's first 18 months of life. Not that I'm aware of. And would a checkup even be able to identify if a child might be at a higher risk, or would it only be known after the fact? The next thing we found was that vaccine inserts produced by vaccine makers themselves list serious side effects of vaccines, including brain injury and death. Again, right there in plain sight. But most of all, we found that the stories of parents of vaccine-injured children were and are simply too numerous and too concerning to overlook. Stories of parents who saw an immediate and tragically permanent regression in the development of their child after being vaccinated. So I believe you've already, or will over the next day and a half, heard from some parents of vaccine-injured children. Some proponents of mandatory vaccination are quick to dismiss such stories, saying that, well, vaccines couldn't have caused these injuries, that just because there was a temporal connection doesn't mean that there's a causal connection. That may be true in some cases. But the sheer number of these instances, and for anyone who cares to look, they are not hard to find. The sheer number is just too large to suggest that all of these parents are making this stuff up. That they're all just looking for a scapegoat. And they want to blame vaccines for their illnesses. To dismiss these parents in such a manner, well, it's not only grossly insensitive and mean, it just isn't plausible statistically. So when we added all that up, the stories from parents of vaccine-injured children, some of whom we heard from personally, by the way, not just on the internet, the warnings and the inserts from vaccine makers themselves, the fact that some people can't get vaccines due to safety concerns, the thousands of adverse effects reported every year, both in Canada and the United States, that likely represent only a fraction of the total, the fact that the top court in the United States has called vaccines unavoidably unsafe, in justifying the need for a special vaccine injury compensation program in that country. The fact that there was a special court in the United States specifically set up to handle expected cases of vaccine injury, and that court has found compensable vaccine injury in thousands of cases and ordered billions of dollars of damages of the families injured. When we added all that up, we were no longer convinced that the blanket statement, vaccines are safe and effective, was accurate. While we understood that despite all this evidence, the likelihood of a serious and permanent vaccine injury was still probably rare, there was certainly a risk there that we needed to weigh against any benefits of vaccination. At the very least, the evidence we discovered suggested that a more accurate claim on the safety and efficacy of vaccines is that vaccines are mostly safe and mostly effective. But I've never once heard a proponent of vaccination describe vaccines in those words. And I encourage you to consider, why is that? In the end, we decided we could live with ourselves if one of our children contracted a vaccine-preventable disease. But we could not live with ourselves if one of our children suffered a permanent vaccine injury. So we decided not to vaccinate our children. and we still think that choice is in the best interest of the health of our children and of our family. These 4 kids here, are they still here? 2 of them are here. They've never received a vaccine. They're healthy kids. They're thriving in school, in sports, and socially. Like most kids, they probably eat too much sugar, but we're stressing the importance of a healthy eating and a physical activity, and we try to lead by example. We feel that if they do contract a vaccine-preventable disease, they'd probably be miserable for a few days, and one of us would have to take a few days off work. But in the end, we're confident that their immune system would do what it's supposed to do to fight the illness. And they would get better and come out a week or so later with lifelong immunity to that particular disease. I'm not saying that my kids are healthy because they're not vaccinated, but I am saying clearly vaccination isn't a necessity for raising healthy kids. We also understand that if they do contract the measles or the mumps, for example, there could be complications from that. And they could be, in rare circumstances, serious complications from that. Our eyes are wide open. The choice to vaccinate or not, it's not an easy one. We didn't take it lightly. We don't take it lightly. It's not a black and white issue. I 100% respect decisions of parents who have chosen to vaccinate and would never suggest that they have made a wrong decision as long as it was an informed decision. There are risks on both sides of this issue, and to suggest that it's one-sided and that the science is settled and it's case closed, I think frankly is a reckless disregard of the information and evidence that is plainly out there for everyone to see. And because there are risks on both sides, the decision whether or not to vaccinate must be the parents to make and not mandated or coerced by the government. Do I have a time update? Good?
You have 16 minutes to go. You're good.
Okay.
I'll let you know when you get to 20.
Thank you. I understand that there was a lawyer here yesterday that gave you an overview on kind of the constitutional and charter arguments, so I won't dive too deep into that today, but my legal background does, I think, allow me to comment on that with some insight. And I'd just like to underscore what the lawyer said yesterday was that the long-held legal doctrine of informed consent to medical treatment is guaranteed in Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Everyone has the right to security of the person. It means we get to decide what goes into their kids' bodies and what doesn't. We get to make those decisions for our children until they reach the age of majority, and only in emergency situations have courts in Canada infringed on this right. But vaccination is not an emergency situation, I would argue. Vaccinating healthy children against diseases they may or may not ever contract is not an emergency. So these proposed amendments, they infringe on a child's charter rights to security of the person. They infringe on a parent's right to decide what does and doesn't go into their child's body, or in other words, to consent to medical treatment for their child, because the decision is no longer just about the relative risks of one course of action or another, being the risk of vaccinating versus not vaccinating, but now, if these amendments pass, the decision can involve an exclusion from public school and child care facilities. The Minister of Education has suggested that it's not a big deal for parents to homeschool or to send their kids to private school. But, as we know, tax-paying parents who help fund the public school system, we don't all have the financial means to send our kids to public school or to have one parent quit their job. If these amendments pass, the vaccinate or not decision will no longer be solely a medical decision, but a question of livelihood for many families who have made an informed decision not to vaccinate their kids. Implicit in the doctrine of informed consent to medical treatment is the right that there's no coercion or undue influence involved. So depriving parents who choose not to vaccinate the ability to send their kids to public school constitutes government coercion and undue influence, and is therefore contrary to the principles of fundamental justice, and I would submit contrary to Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Of course, proponents of these amendments will say, well, it's a justifiable infringement, that the rights of others who can't be vaccinated trump my rights as a parent to decide what goes into my kids' bodies. It trumps my rights as a parent to decide whether I give my kids vaccines. They argue that because diseases like measles and mumps are contagious, everyone has a duty to get vaccinated so that they can protect others, not just themselves. They need to protect others because, as mentioned, vaccines don't work for everyone, and we need to protect those who can't get vaccinated. To those two arguments, which I believe are the central two arguments to this whole bill, I respectfully and wholeheartedly disagree. As for those for whom the vaccine isn't effective, I mean, when you think about it, is it not perverse logic to require that a person get the same vaccine that didn't work for another person in order to protect that other person? It actually reminds me about something I learned years ago when I failed miserably at a knot tying workshop. I was terrible at tying knots, and I still am to this day. The advice I got then was, if you can't tie a knot, tie a lot. You ever heard that? If you can't tie a knot, you tie a lot. The same thing is going on here, in my opinion. If we can't make vaccines that work for everybody, let's get everybody vaccinated. It's a good business model for vaccine makers, for sure, but it's not justification for infringing on charter rights and on informed consent to medical treatment. And now it gets a little more complicated when we're talking about kids who can't get vaccinated. I do. I think about this a lot. This is a significant question. Do I vaccinate my kids to protect kids who can't get vaccinated? But when you think about what we're trying to do and what that is saying you need to get vaccinated because some other kid can't in order to protect that other kid, we're trying to create this contagion-free society that, I ask you, is it actually possible to create? Because as far as I know, these kids that are immunocompromised, and my heart goes out to them and their families, just as it does to the kids who are vaccine injured and their families. It's not just vaccine preventable diseases that they need to be concerned about if they're going to be engaging in public circles. There are all kinds of other contagions out there as well. So at the end of the day, I feel for these kids, I do. But this bill, if it passes, is not going to achieve the ends that the Minister of Education and those who are supporting this bill think it will. There will still be outbreaks. I believe, as the Chief Medical Officer said yesterday, that this bill would not prevent, it's not going to prevent future outbreaks, or at least she said, I believe, that it wouldn't have prevented the outbreak that we saw in St. John. So what are we doing? Why are we considering this bill, which is going to trample on individuals' long-entrenched rights to informed medical consent, long-entrenched rights in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in order to achieve an objective that is not likely to be achieved? We are going to be no further ahead unless this is the first step, and I don't know if this is the case or not, but unless this is the first step in a very slippery slope to excluding unvaccinated kids from every sphere of public life. And I suppose if this bill passes, that will remain to be seen. But if this bill does pass, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that our family will no longer be living in New Brunswick. And so we'll be watching from another province. I urge you, members of the committee, to please recommend to your colleagues in the legislature to vote against these amendments. New Brunswick already has one of the most stringent vaccination policies in Canada when it comes to public school admission. Can we just leave the status quo, where the vast majority of kids are already vaccinated? Can we not leave the right of conscientious, informed, logical, analytical parents to make a decision not to vaccinate their children? I'd be pleased to take some questions.
Thank you. Mr. McKee?
Thank you, Mr. Clark, for your presentation today. So just to cover on your background, you are, well, I guess you have a law degree. I'm not sure if you're practicing currently.
Not currently practicing.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you work with a group of chartered professional accountants and advisors as the COO, is that correct?
I do. You've done your homework. I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm speaking solely on my family's behalf today.
You're here on your own behalf and for no other group or organization, is that correct?
That is correct, yes. And I am playing hooky from work today, so thanks for pointing that out, Mr. McKee.
So to talk about, you touched on it, that protecting other kids that cannot be vaccinated. So one question I had is, do you feel that your children, you said, have lived healthy lives, would they have benefited from other kids being vaccinated? Do you truly believe that they would have lived equally healthy lives had the vaccination rate been lower?
I do, because I believe in the ability of an immune system to do what it's supposed to do, which is to combat disease when it comes into the body. And so I believe that if our kids are to contract measles or mumps or one of these other diseases, that their immune system will work properly. And there are things you can do to improve the efficacy of an immune system. Like I said, there's healthy eating and activity and, stress management and these sorts of things. Of course, I can't be sure, but that's our approach.
So you mentioned the lawyer yesterday who gave his opinion that there would be an infringement under sections. He mentioned 2A, 2B, and 7. We had an opinion as well today from the child and youth advocate who stated that if there was a breach, it would be justified under Section 1 of the Charter. And so your opinion is that it would not be justified, is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. I'm more familiar with Section 7 than I am of Section 2 on the religious freedoms, which I think Mr. Kitchen spoke about. But my knowledge of Section 7, in order to justify an infringement of that, it must be in an emergency situation. And in my view, vaccinating healthy children is not an emergency situation.
And so his opinion, I guess, was based on, public health immunization goals and raising the rate of immunization, and in your opinion, you don't feel that that is a threat to public health as it stands?
I don't feel it's a threat to public health as it stands, and I would also say that the goals of public health and the goals of individual health aren't always aligned. And that's what the Charter of Rights is there for, is to protect individual freedoms and individual rights. And I understand that there is a good discussion to be had around this, 100%. But in my view, the decision would have to come down in this case on individual rights, because when we talk about, from a public health perspective, that the benefits of vaccines far outweigh the risks, well, is that the case for a child who's been injured by a vaccine?
Thank you.
I had one question, but I think I'll let
you
it move on. But I want to wish you the best of luck with your new high school.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to need it.
Mr. Northrup.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the Clark family, welcome.
Thank you.
It's certainly encouraging to see you here with your wife and family. And if I could give you any advice at all, kids grow up quick, and just wait to before you become a grandmother and a grandfather, because that really happens quick. So that's just kind of a little bit of advice that I would like to give you. But family is what life is all about, and you've expressed that very sincerely and very heartfully. And not only as an MLA, but as a father, I certainly appreciate that. And I just want to ask you, were you vaccinated when you were a little bit younger than I am? A few generations back, were you vaccinated when you were growing up?
You know, it's funny you asked that, Mr. Northrup, because I was thinking about that this morning, and I didn't know the answer. And I texted my mom, and I said, was I vaccinated, and were my brothers, and did we get any of these contagious diseases? And we were vaccinated. And we did get chickenpox, and I don't believe chickenpox was a vaccine back then. So, yeah, I mean, we didn't, actually, she couldn't remember if it was measles or chickenpox, but she remembers removing my diaper and seeing the spots, and then my two brothers got it, and we were home for school for a week, and now we've got immunity.
And you sit here as a normal person, so that's...
A normal is a strong word, Mr. Northrup, but thank you.
Okay, alleged normal person, maybe that's better, but no, thank you for being here. It's
Thank you.
very enlightening.
Mr. DeSantis?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you for being here and presenting. You have a lovely family, and I'm glad they ate the muffins, because I certainly didn't need them. Right. I'm going to ask you a question that I wanted to ask Mr. Kitchen yesterday. And in your opinion, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, would parental rights fall under individual rights and freedoms? Do you believe that would be the case? What people call parental rights?
Yes, I do, because, I mean, all individuals have protection of the Charter, including children, but of course, children aren't able to enforce those rights themselves, so then it's up to parents to do that for them until the kids each reach the age of majority.
Thank you. I was hoping that was the case. I just want to close by saying I appreciate your logic and your candor and your arguments. They all seem to be driven by sound logic and research, etc. You're not driven by any pain inflicted on you by others, and I can only think that you're being here, you're being true, and you're being honest to your family. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, we have 1 minute left. Go right ahead if you talk fast.
That's the last question. I'm glad you mentioned Bill 39. I don't think we've talked about it enough, like the bill itself. Do you think that, so if the recognized medical bodies, if their goal is to increase the vaccination rate in the province, do you think Bill 39 will permit that, or will help the province achieve that goal? By kind of imposing the vaccination on kids and using school as a mean to kind of pressure the parents?
I do think so. I think if you were coercing parents to get vaccinated with the threat of not being able to participate in public education, I think that a lot of parents will say, well, my kids need to get educated. I can't afford to homeschool. I can't afford to send them to private school. I guess we're getting the shots. So yes, I do think it will increase vaccination rates. I thought it was interesting yesterday when the president of the New Brunswick Medical Society pointed to California and said that the same legislation in California was able to raise vaccination rates by 2%. So, again, is that justifying this bill? If it's a stretch perhaps to say that New Brunswick is the same as California, but there is some precedent there to say that if you're going to have mandatory vaccines, you're only going to increase vaccination rates by 2%? Is that really worth what everyone acknowledges as the trampling of individual rights and freedoms?
Okay, good, thanks. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Mr. Chiasson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing your family. I love seeing young people engaged in a political process, so congratulations. You're clearly raising some good citizens. My comments really probably are not necessary, but it sounds like you have a mother, much like mine, who was also unsure after after 4 kids,
Right.
she lost track, right? One of you got measles, right?
Right.
And I sympathize with you because I have my first high schooler also.
Okay, let's compare notes.
Yeah, anyway,
Thank you.